Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to dive into the epic and honestly incredibly violent transformation of Russia. We'll be mapping out exactly how it went from a centuries-old monarchy straight into the world's very first communist state. If you picture those rich, classic historical maps of the early 20th century, you see this enormous Russian empire ruled by the Romanov dynasty since 1613. But in the span of just a few extremely turbulent years, that vast imperial map was completely redrawn. We're going to explore how Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party engineered one of the most consequential political events of modern history, creating a template of revolution and absolute control that would eventually spread all across the globe.
Okay, let's look at our roadmap for today. 1. Collapse of the monarchy. 2. Lenin and the vanguard. 3. Civil war and terror. 4. Birth of the USSR. And 5. A global communist template.
Section 1. Collapse of the monarchy. A country breaking under war. To really wrap our heads around the dual revolutions of 1917, we first have to look at the devastating catalyst, and it comes down to this number, 1.7 million. That's a staggering figure, right? It represents the estimated Russian soldiers killed in the Grey War. You see, Russia wasn't just experiencing some sudden political hiccup. This was an empire structurally collapsing under the crushing weight of World War I. And the disaster wasn't just confined to the trenches. Back on the home front, widespread food shortages completely emptied bakery shelves in major cities like Petrograd and Moscow by the war's third winter. Tsar Nicholas II's autocratic rule grew increasingly discredited, especially after he made the disastrous decision to personally take command of the army on the Eastern Front in 1915. That left his deeply unpopular wife Alexandra, who was heavily influenced by the mystic Rasputin, in charge of domestic affairs back in the capital. The monarchy was just losing total legitimacy.
Now, ironically, after the Tsar was forced to step down in March 1917, the new temporary provisional government, briefly led by Alexander Kerensky, actually tolerated a free press and allowed competing political parties to exist. It was this rare, brief window of pluralism, but they made one fatal miscalculation. They totally refused to withdraw Russia from the absolute carnage of World War I. And this was despite mass desertions from the military and just explosive anger among the general public.
Section 2. Lenin and the Vanguard. Ideology meets opportunity.
So as that popular anger exploded over the continuing war, Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik party saw their opening. They capitalized on the chaos, fiercely guided by Marxist ideology. This is the belief that history is driven by class struggle and that the workers, not a capitalist elite or landed aristocracy, should control the state's resources. But here's the absolutely crucial point. Lenin didn't actually believe the working class, the proletariat, would naturally or spontaneously rise up and succeed on their own. As early as his 1902 pamphlet, What Is to Be Done, Lenin argued they needed a vanguard party. He envisioned a highly disciplined, professional revolutionary group that would direct the class struggle, lead the revolution, and seize the state entirely on the workers' behalf.
Politically, things started moving at a dizzying pace. We're talking about 2 revolutions in a single year. March sees the abdication of the Tsar. Fast forward to November, which is known historically as the October Revolution because of the old Russian calendar. And revolutionary sailors seize the Winter Palace in Petrograd in just a matter of hours, almost bloodlessly. But notice the immediate pivot here. By January 1918, when a newly elected Constituent Assembly finally convenes, the Bolsheviks realize they only want a minority of the seats. So what is Lenin's immediate response? He dissolves the assembly after a single session, effectively eliminating any chance of democratic rule.
To secure their fragile new government and fulfill their promise to a completely war-weary public, the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was a separate peace treaty with Germany. But the territorial cost was absolutely enormous. By ending their World War I involvement, Russia formally surrendered control over Ukraine, Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states.
Section 3. Civil War and Terror. Consolidating Power.
Pulling out of World War I didn't actually bring peace. It plunged the country straight into a devastating internal conflict. The old imperial order was gone, and rival factions furiously scrambled to control the vacuum it left behind. From 1918 to 1921, a brutal civil war ripped across the map. On one side, you had the Bolshevik Red Army, highly and ruthlessly organized by Leon Trotsky, and on the other side was the White Army. Now, the White Army wasn't really a unified force at all, but rather a loosely allied coalition of anti-communist opposition forces, monarchists, and foreign interventionists.
Just pause and think about this estimate for a second. Between 7 and 12 million people were killed during this brief 3-year civil war window. It's a mind-boggling number. And this astronomical death toll wasn't just from combat. It was heavily driven by deliberately induced famine and rampant disease sweeping across the shattered landscape. To ruthlessly crush any internal opposition during this existential fight, Lenin established the Cheka, the very first iteration of the Soviet secret police, led by Felix Dzerzhinsky. Lenin explicitly authorized the Red Terror. This was a systematic campaign of extreme violence where suspected political enemies, counter-revolutionaries, or really anyone deemed a threat to proletarian rule, were executed swiftly, permanently, and entirely without trial.
But even with the terror and their eventual military victory, the Bolsheviks were facing absolute economic ruin by 1921. Factory production had totally collapsed, and former loyalists, like the sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, were actually rising up in armed rebellion against Bolshevik authoritarianism. So Lenin had to temporarily retreat from strict Marxist economics. He introduced the New Economic Policy, or NEP, which pragmatically allowed a limited return to private trade and farming for profit. It was a necessary step just to stabilize the starving, shattered state.
Section 4. Birth of the USSR. Creating the authoritarian state. Winning the Civil War finally gave Lenin the space to build a genuine, centralized one-party state, completely stripping away any legal opposition whatsoever. They were building the machinery of total control. The regime didn't just target monarchists either. They suppressed, imprisoned, or exiled political rivals like the Mensheviks, who, by the way, were once fellow socialists sharing revolutionary platforms with the Bolsheviks. The government dismantled private ownership by decree, nationalizing major industries and redistributing vast noble estates practically overnight. On top of that, they established early labor camps. These were the foundations of the vast gulag system, created specifically to confine political prisoners rather than ordinary criminals. And to ensure complete compliance, they implemented heavy censorship, controlling newspapers, schools, and the arts to shape a single, approved version of reality from childhood onward.
By centralizing this massive apparatus of control and pumping out relentless state propaganda, the map was redrawn yet again. On December 30th, 1922, Russia and its neighboring territories, including Ukraine, Belarus, and the Caucasus, were formally united under a single communist government headquartered in Moscow. Within just 5 turbulent years, a war-torn imperial monarchy was entirely transformed into an ideologically unified authoritarian state, the Soviet Union.
Section 5. A global communist template. The lasting ripple. Now, the tightly controlled systems forged during those bloody years didn't just stay confined to Moscow. Lenin was an internationalist. He expressly founded the Communist International, known as the Comintern, in 1919. Its specific purpose was to spread revolutionary ideology beyond Soviet borders. Moscow literally became a hub for training revolutionaries from dozens of countries, preparing them to return home and execute this exact same model of vanguard-led insurrection.
But the leadership of this global movement was soon up for grabs. Lenin suffered a series of strokes and passed away in January 1924. Immediately, a fierce power struggle erupted at the very top of the party between Joseph Stalin and Leon Trotsky over who would rightfully inherit Lenin's authority and correctly interpret his Marxist legacy.
Stalin eventually won that succession struggle by 1928, and he went on to expand Lenin's early labor camps into a vast network of forced labor sites stretching all across Siberia. But the legacy expanded way beyond Russia. Decades later, leaders across entirely different continents, like Mao Zedong in China, Fidel Castro in Cuba, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and Kim Il-sung in North Korea, all drew directly on the Soviet template forged between 1917 and 1922. They adopted the exact same mechanisms: one-party rule, a ruthless secret police force, and centrally planned, state-owned economies. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a provocative thought. The Bolshevik Revolution wasn't just some isolated historical event trapped in the sepia tones of 1917, it was the birth of an entire architecture of power. Consider how the mechanisms of totalitarianism, the suppression of opposition, and the concept of state-run truth built during those 5 turbulent years continue to echo. How do these historical blueprints continue to influence the geopolitical landscape, the boundaries on our maps, and the ideological conflicts we see playing out in our world today? Thank you so much for exploring this vital history with me.